Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into one of the darkest chapters in American history. Now, it's a story you might think you know, but at its heart, it's really about what happens when an entire system of laws and government breaks down, leading to an unimaginable tragedy. You know, this quote from a U.S. soldier who was right there on the ground in 1838, it just captures the sheer brutality of it all. This wasn't some distant policy debate. It was a violent, state-sponsored act against thousands and thousands of families. And that, right there, that's the central question, isn't it? How can you win in the highest court in the land and still be forcibly marched from your home? To really get it, we need to unpack how a series of calculated political moves completely dismantled every single protection the Cherokee people had. So first, we've got to understand who the Cherokee people actually were at this time. Because they weren't this nomadic tribe that you might picture. They were a sophisticated modern republic. Just take a look at this. It shows you just how incredibly advanced the Cherokee Nation was. I mean, they had a written constitution, a government with 3 branches, their own court system, even a police force. They'd modeled their government directly on the United States. They even developed their own written language and became incredibly successful farmers, totally embracing the civilized life that the U.S. government had been pushing them toward. And this is the absolute tragic irony of the whole thing. Their success, their progress, it didn't earn them any respect or protection. Instead, it made them a permanent political rival for millions of acres of land that the state of Georgia desperately wanted. In a way, their success pretty much sealed their fate. So you have this simmering tension, right? And then in 1828, it just explodes. And what was the trigger? Gold. The Georgia Gold Rush kicked off an all-out legislative war that was designed for one thing, to break the Cherokee Nation. I mean, just look at this timeline. It lays out a totally systematic attack. First, Georgia just illegally annexes Cherokee land. Then, it bans them from mining their own gold. And then, the final blow in 1830, a law that basically says the entire Cherokee government and all its laws, poof, they're gone. They were literally erasing a nation with a stroke of a pen. But this last law, wow, it was devastating. Think about it. By making it impossible for a Cherokee to testify against a white person, Georgia basically gave people a green light for theft, for violence, anything. With absolutely no way to defend themselves in state courts, the Cherokee Nation turned to its last hope, the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, when we talk about the legal fight, people often think it was just one big court case, but it was actually 2 separate cases, and they had totally different outcomes. So in that first case, the big question for the court was, what are the Cherokee, legally speaking? And Chief Justice John Marshall comes up with this fascinating term, domestic dependent nation. He argued they weren't a foreign country, but a distinct nation that was under the protection of the U.S. government, kind of like a ward to his guardian. Okay, so this table really breaks it down for us. You see the 2-step legal battle. In 1831, with Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, they lose. The court basically says, sorry, you're not a foreign country, so you can't sue a state. It's a technicality, but it's a huge legal defeat. But then, just 1 year later, a U.S. citizen named Samuel Worcester challenges Georgia's laws, and this time, boom, a totally different result. I mean, this ruling was a total vindication for the Cherokee. The Supreme Court declared Georgia's laws unconstitutional, period. It affirmed that the Cherokee Nation was its own distinct political community. On paper, this was it. They had won. But as the Cherokee were about to find out in the most tragic way possible, a Supreme Court ruling, well, it's only as strong as the president who's willing to back it up. And President Andrew Jackson, a man who was all in on Indian removal, he had absolutely zero intention of enforcing it. Now, he might not have said those exact words, but they perfectly capture his defiant attitude. He just ignored the court's decision. And this is what's so revealing. At the exact same time all this is happening with Georgia, you've got South Carolina trying to nullify federal tariff laws. And Jackson's response? He threatens to send in the army to enforce federal power. It just shows you this wasn't about states' rights, not at all. It was a cold political calculation. He enforced federal law when it worked for him, and he ignored it when it got in the way of his removal policy. So what you have here is a complete breakdown of the system of checks and balances. The judicial branch made its ruling, but the executive branch just refused to act, and that left the decision completely meaningless, and the Cherokee people with no protection at all. All right, let's get to the final, heartbreaking act of this story and see how this total legal failure spiraled into a fraudulent treaty and ultimately a human catastrophe. So, since the U.S. couldn't get the actual, legitimate Cherokee government under Chief John Ross to surrender, they basically just invented a new treaty partner. They found this tiny, unauthorized faction of a few hundred Cherokee and signed a treaty with them, ceding all Cherokee land. And the U.S. Senate, knowing it was a complete fraud, protested by over 15,000 Cherokee citizens, ratified it by just one vote. And this is the result. 4,000. Just let that number sink in. That's the estimated number of Cherokee men, women, and children who died. It was a quarter of their entire nation gone. Dead from disease, from starvation, from exposure on the forced march west. And we come back to the words of Private Burnett, that soldier on the ground. It just reminds you of the horrific human cost. This wasn't just a number. It was individual lives, lost to pure cruelty and neglect, night after night for almost a year. And this, right here, is the ultimate bitter irony of this entire story. That Supreme Court decision from 1832, the one that failed so completely to protect the Cherokee, it wasn't forgotten. Its core principles, that tribes are distinct political communities where state laws have no force, became the legal bedrock for tribal sovereignty in the 20th and 21st centuries. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. That same fraudulent treaty used to justify the Trail of Tears, it also contained a promise, a delegate for the Cherokee Nation in the U.S. Congress. A promise made nearly 200 years ago and still unkept, connecting this dark past directly to a debate that is happening right now, today.